Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. My name is Najwa Awad. I am a licensed clinical social worker, a psychotherapist in private practice in Maryland. And inshallah today, I will be talking about the Duha approach for addressing trauma from a psycho-spiritual framework. This is a topic that my colleague Sultan and I have been working on for the past couple of years in terms of um, publishing an article series about this very topic and presenting at major Muslim conventions about the integration of the psychospiritual framework with working in trauma. And so very excited today, inshallah, to be able to talk to you about this framework. So what is the Duha approach? When we look in the Quran and specifically at Surah Duha, we can see that there is an evidence-based therapeutic framework in terms of dealing with complex trauma. And that Muslim clinicians can really derive some key strategies in terms of addressing trauma from a faith-based perspective based off of the surah. And one of the most beautiful and powerful things about the surah is that we have Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the creator of the universe, who knows best, comforting the Prophet ﷺ during a time of distress. And when we look at the context of the life of the Prophet ﷺ, subhanAllah, he has had many events that would be considered traumatic: orphanhood, severe poverty, being a victim of physical assault, emotional abuse. He also went to war, has seen death, lost people who were very close to him. So when we look at Allah giving support and comfort to the Prophet ﷺ, who had endured all these things, but his distress was specific to this moment in which the surah was revealed, we can see techniques that are very effective. And present day, we can see that they are evidence-based and that there is research to support these interventions. Not that Allah needs research or evidence to support what he does, but the fact that there is secular research that supports these strategies is amazing. And so we have coined these strategies collectively as the Duha approach. And so we hope that with this Duha approach, that this can be a good stepping stone, inshallah, for clinicians and researchers to be able to address trauma from an Islamic perspective, which is really not present in the clinical literature at this time. So inshallah, I'm going to talk a little bit more about Islamic integration of this approach. The whole thing is based off of a surah, so I don't know if you can have more Islamic integration than that. But I will go into the surah just very briefly and talk about the interventions that we can pull based off of this. So it starts out with وَالضُّحَى وَاللَّيْلِ إِذَا سَجَى, by the morning brightness and by the night when it covers with darkness. And so we start out with the surah with hope that there is light at the end of the tunnel. And then it goes directly into, your Lord has not forsaken you, nor has he detested you. And this is such a profound ayah in terms of trauma and spirituality. So many of our clients, when they experience trauma, one of the first things that they think of is, did I do something wrong? Is there a punishment? Does Allah hate me? Is there something wrong with me? And so here we have Allah telling the Prophet ﷺ, he has not forsaken him. And we know that just because something bad or traumatic happens to you, it doesn't mean that Allah has forsaken the person. And so we can really drive this home with clients when they start to develop spiritual, cognitive distortions or cognitive dissonance after a traumatic experience. It really also drives home the idea of attachment. And so, when we experience trauma, a lot of times we feel maybe that Allah has forsaken us, but also we feel perhaps that there might be some kind of disruption in attachment with Allah. So in our work with our clients, it's important not only to work on attachment with people in their lives immediately, but also attachment with Allah too. And we know that some of the attachment, some of the cognitions that we have about attachment from our surroundings can also affect our cognitions about Allah and our attachment with Allah. So they go hand in hand, and this is really, it can be a very important thing for clinicians to utilize in trauma treatment. And then the next ayah after that is, and the hereafter is better for you than the first life, and your Lord is going to give you, and you will be satisfied. And what this does is it really talks about perspective. And whether you're looking at cognitive therapy, dialectical behavioral therapy, acceptance commitment therapy, you're looking at shifting perspective. That when we are in the midst of tremendous grief or trauma, anxiety, depression, it feels like we're never going to get out, that we are completely overwhelmed with these emotions. And this perspective, it shows, this perspective helps show that feelings and the things that we're going through are temporary and that they will get better. But I think also in that this ayah takes it further, that not necessarily that after trauma there is life and things can get better, but even if there is injustice in this dunya or things don't get better in this dunya, there is the akhirah for justice. There is the akhirah where we will feel contentment and safety. And so and this ayah really illustrates, perspective, looking at things from a different perspective. And then the next ayah after that is, did he not find you an orphan and give you free refuge? And he found you lost and guided you. And he found you poor and made you self-sufficient. And really what this is when you look at it, it's very similar to cognitive therapy. Allah is directly working with the cognitions of the Prophet ﷺ and gently reshaping his perspective about things. So we know with all the different interventions with trauma that cognitive therapy does have a place in terms of looking at all the unhealthy cognitions that can result from our pain and from our world being completely shaken up, and that cognitive therapy can help us, help heal us. And then the next ayah after that, so as for the orphan, do not oppress him, and as for the petitioner, do not repel him. And this really reminded us of behavioral activation, in that, a lot of times we work with our patients in terms of healing them so they can go back to life and do the things that they want to do. But also it goes the other way around in that sometimes we have to make goals and we have to take action in order for the healing to take effect. And then lastly, and as for the favor of your Lord, report it. And this really goes to, this really illustrates the importance of gratitude. And in the research, it's very clear, even if you take faith out of it, the importance of gratitude in healing and just in mental wellness in general. So in terms of Islamic integration, the Duha approach is really a holistic model where it integrates the mind, the body, and the heart. And this ties spirituality into trauma work, which is often overlooked. It took a while, it took not just until like maybe a few decades ago for people to really implement the body into trauma work, but the heart is still overlooked. And this is something very important, something that our clients are really yearning and looking for in terms of tying that spirituality into trauma work. This model teaches that Muslims, that there's many types of trauma, and that the prophets experienced events that would be considered traumatic. Not just the Prophet ﷺ, but when you look at even Prophet Yusuf, for example, being abandoned by his brothers, almost killed, going into slavery, being imprisoned. And so it shows that, trauma is not for bad people or for people that Allah has forsaken. The best of mankind have experienced things in their lives that would be considered traumatic. It also demonstrates to Muslims the concept of post-traumatic growth and living past the life of trauma, that not only can you come back to baseline, but you can grow and spiritually, you can grow holistically as a result of your trauma and be better off than you were before. The model can also directly address faith-based doubts that come up with trauma. And so again, just because you've experienced trauma doesn't mean that Allah has forsaken you. And then lastly, it completely debunks any notion that psychology and Islam cannot be put together. And this is a myth, whether we like it or not, that continues to exist in Muslim communities, where people think psychology is haram or therapy is haram. And so here we can see seamlessly and beautifully how psychology and Islam can be interwoven. So what would this look like in terms of practical clinical application? So in the office, this is really for clients who want to use a model. Obviously, you wouldn't use this approach for people who are not interested in integrating spirituality into their treatment. And so a clinician, when they are working with a client, they can provide psychoeducation on this model of treatment. And that the model in of itself can be therapeutic and grounding. Just being able to go back to the surah and seeing some of these things with their own eyes and revisiting it when they are feeling distressed can be very calming and reassuring. And this model would be used with standard trauma work. So it's not to say that, it's a standalone and it would work by itself. You would still use it with regular trauma work. So you'd be working on stabilization, emotion regulation, making sure that the client is able to self-soothe and being able to work on that first, then the trauma work, and then integration. So the Duha principles can be integrated throughout as appropriate. In terms of theory, we can see that there is a place for cognitive behavioral theory, for cognitive theory and therapy, to be able to correct unhealthy thoughts or cognitive distortions that come up about faith as a result of trauma. So here we're connecting theory, we're connecting the surah and theory, and then the practical application. And then also attachment work in terms of using that attachment work that we typically use with maybe a family of origin or a spouse or a parent or whatnot, and using that to help a client repair or improve their relationship with Allah after some kind of traumatic incident. And some other just notes, how we can continue to integrate spirituality into trauma work, especially with this model, is that we can use prophet stories to be able to establish hope and triumph over adversity. Also, this creates space in terms of integrating ayat and hadith for healing, that we're not just using the Quran and hadith from left field. It goes very nicely in terms of the rest of the framework. And then lastly, we can use this framework to empower clients, not just to use spirituality for healing, but then also for spiritual growth as a person afterwards. So not just for getting back to baseline, but again, for post-traumatic growth, so that the person can be in a better holistic place than they were before. So to conclude, there really isn't a lot of research and writing addressing trauma from a spiritual perspective, and definitely not from an Islamic perspective. Surah Duha really does provide a holistic framework in terms of dealing with complex trauma. It really integrates that the trauma work with the mind and the body and the heart. And techniques that we can see from the surah that are not only effective but evidence-based, that would be shifting perspective, cognitive therapy, behavioral activation, cultivating gratitude. And so we encourage clinicians and researchers to expand on this work in terms of creating more literature and evidence-based practices that tie in trauma with faith. As I mentioned before, my colleague Sarah, Sultan, and I, we created a series. It's a video and article series. It's titled Your Lord Has Not Forsaken You, Addressing the Impact of Trauma on Faith. That can be found on yaqeeninstitute.org. It's specifically for clients who want to work on cognitive distortions from this perspective. And it's really nice in that each chapter also has a workbook kind of end to it, in which that they're not just reading through the article, but they're also able to work on their cognitions with a therapist, or on their own if that's something that they would like to do. Not that it's a substitute for therapy, but again, you can find that on yaqeeninstitute.org. It was great being able to share this with you, and we look forward to your questions.